On a routine flight, billionaire businessman Shaq notices a quiet boy sketching something eerily familiar, a house from Shaq's past. The child, traveling alone, refuses to explain why he's there or who he's looking for. As turbulence shakes the plane, the boy clutches his chest, whispering a chilling message. I had to say goodbye. With time slipping away, Shaq uncovers a heartbreaking truth. The boy isn't just a stranger. He's carrying a message tied to a past Shaq thought he had left behind. But why him? And why now? As the plane descends, one final revelation changes everything, proving that some ghosts don't stay buried. They find their way back when it's already too late. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Big Shaq adjusted the cuffs of his designer jacket as he strode through the dimly lit airport terminal. It was past midnight, and exhaustion tugged at his senses, but he masked it well beneath his usual air of confidence. The world had come to know him as a ruthless businessman, a man who turned everything he touched into gold. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man who had long mastered the art of emotional detachment. As he approached the gate, his assistant had reminded him of his packed schedule for the next day. Meetings, calls, negotiations. His life was a never-ending cycle of power plays. He barely acknowledged the flight attendant's polite nod as he stepped onto the plane, heading straight to his first-class seat. He wasn't one for small talk with strangers. He preferred silence, efficiency, and control. Settling into his seat, he reached for his phone, skimming through emails. The usual corporate jargon blurred together, numbers and deals intertwining in a mental checklist. The hum of passengers finding their seats filled the cabin, but it was nothing more than background noise, until something unusual caught his eye. A few rows ahead, a boy sat alone, hunched over the tray table, his small fingers gripping a napkin. His wrist flicked carefully, deliberate strokes sketching something intricate. The dim cabin lights cast a soft glow on his pale face, highlighting the dark smudges beneath his tired eyes. Something about his stillness unsettled Shaq. At first he dismissed it as nothing, just another kid keeping himself entertained on a long flight. But the way the boy's shoulders curled inward, the way he kept glancing around as if making sure no one was watching, it was different, unnatural. Shaq wasn't the type to involve himself in other people's business, yet he couldn't look away. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts, offering pre-flight drinks to first-class passengers. Not once did any of them acknowledge the boy. No one asked him where his parents were. No one even noticed him. Shaq's brows furrowed. Was the kid traveling alone? It wasn't uncommon, but something about it didn't sit right. He glanced toward the boarding gate, wondering if a frantic guardian would come running in at the last moment. But the doors closed with a firm click. The boy wasn't waiting for anyone. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing the flight's departure. As the plane taxied down the runway, Shaq turned his attention back to his phone, forcing himself to ignore the lingering unease twisting in his chest. But as the aircraft lifted into the sky, he stole another glance at the boy. The napkin was now covered in a meticulous sketch. A small house, trees surrounding it, smoke curling from the chimney. The detail was remarkable for a child. Every stroke seemed purposeful, every line carefully placed. And then, something strange happened. The boy froze, his pencil hovering midair. His lips parted slightly, and his expression shifted. A quiet sadness overtook his face. Slowly, he traced the outline of a window in the sketch, his fingertip lingering over it as if he were lost in a memory. Shaq found himself gripping the armrest. What was it about this kid that bothered him so much? Minutes passed. The cabin dimmed as passengers settled in. The hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses filled the space, yet the boy remained completely still. His eyes, locked onto the napkin, flickered with something unreadable. Shaq turned away, shaking his head. He was imagining things, overthinking. He had enough on his plate without adding a random kid's problems to it. Still, the image of the boy sketching that house burned into his mind. He sighed, shutting his eyes, convincing himself that whatever story belonged to that child, it wasn't his concern. But deep down, he knew better. Shaq shifted in his seat, attempting to refocus on the email in front of him. But his eyes kept drifting back to the boy, a few rows ahead. The quiet child remained hunched over his tray table, fingers wrapped tightly around a pencil, as he sketched with meticulous precision. Something about the intensity in the boy's posture made it impossible to look away. He wasn't just doodling to pass the time. There was purpose in every line he drew. The turbulence made the cabin lights flicker slightly, and in that brief moment, Shaq caught a glimpse of the full drawing. His breath hitched. It wasn't a random sketch. It was a detailed image of a house. Not just any house, though. It had a large wraparound porch, tall trees looming in the background, a chimney with thin curls of smoke rising into the air. It was lived in, familiar, almost nostalgic. At the center of the drawing stood two figures, an adult man and a woman, their hands resting on the shoulders of a small child. At their feet, a dog sat obediently, tail curled around its paws. Before Shaq could process why the image unsettled him, the boy's fingers twitched, his grip tightening on the napkin. His eyes darted around nervously, and then, as if sensing Shaq's gaze, he abruptly folded the napkin in half and pressed it against his chest. Shaq frowned. Why did the kid seem so protective of it? Most children proudly showed off their artwork to anyone who glanced their way. But this one? He acted like the drawing was a secret. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks to the passengers, but once again, she didn't acknowledge the boy. It was as if he weren't there at all. Shaq drummed his fingers against his armrest, debating with himself. He wasn't the type to poke into strangers' lives, and he certainly wasn't interested in making conversation with a random kid. But something about the way the boy clutched that napkin, the way his hands trembled slightly, made Shaq's instincts twinge. Without fully deciding to, he leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low. "That's a nice drawing." The boy flinched at the sound of his voice. His shoulders stiffened, and for a brief moment, he didn't move at all. Then, slowly, he turned his head, his expression guarded. "Thanks." His voice was barely above a whisper. Shaq studied him. Up close, the kid's eyes looked darker, sunken, like he hadn't slept properly in days. His clothes were clean but slightly oversized, like they had belonged to someone else before him. There was something fragile about the way he held himself, like a porcelain figure on the verge of cracking. Shaq nodded toward the napkin. "You an artist?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "No." That was a lie. Shaq could tell by the way his fingers twitched, like they were desperate to return to the pencil. "You're good, though. That house looks real. You live there?" The boy's grip on the napkin tightened. His jaw tensed slightly. "Used to." Shaq caught the subtle shift in his voice. Past tense. There was weight behind those two words. Something unfinished. "Where you headed?" Shaq pressed, keeping his tone casual. The boy didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered toward the window, as if debating whether or not to say anything at all. Then, softly, he murmured, "Nowhere." Shaq frowned. It wasn't the answer of someone going on vacation or visiting family. It was the answer of someone who didn't know where home was anymore. Before Shaq could ask anything else, the boy shifted away, turning his body slightly so that his side was facing him. The message was clear. He didn't want to talk. Shaq could have left it at that. He could have leaned back, minded his own business, and pretended this conversation never happened. But his eyes caught something else. Just barely peeking out of the boy's coat pocket, partially folded and worn at the edges, was a letter. A letter that looked like it had been carried around for far too long. And written on the corner of the paper, just visible enough under the dim cabin lights, were the words, "If you're reading this, I'm already gone." Shaq's stomach tightened. Something was very, very wrong. Shaq leaned back in his seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in things that weren't his business, but something about this kid gnawed at him, like a whisper from a past he couldn't quite remember. The cabin lights dimmed as the last of the passengers settled in. The gentle hum of the engines vibrated through the aircraft, a low reminder that they'd be airborne soon. Flight attendants moved methodically through the aisle, ensuring everything was in order. The usual pre-flight announcements crackled over the speakers, but Shaq barely registered them. His attention was still on the boy. The kid had grown even quieter, his shoulders tense, His fingers clutched tightly around the folded napkin, as though it held something much heavier than ink. He didn't fidget like most kids did. He didn't glance around at the other passengers. He just stared ahead, expression unreadable. Then, just as Shaq was about to look away, the boy's lips parted, and in a voice so soft it was nearly lost under the murmur of the cabin, he whispered, "Dylan, I'm sorry." Shaq froze. The name shot through him like a sharp, sudden jolt of electricity. His grip on the armrest tightened, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. Dylan. It wasn't an uncommon name. It could have been anyone. But the way the kid said it, the weight in his voice, the quiet sorrow laced into those two syllables, made something deep inside Shaq stir. His mind raced, grasping at memories buried beneath years of success and distance. He didn't know why the name felt so familiar, so personal, but it did. The boy exhaled softly, his eyes fluttering closed. His fingers trembled as he gripped the napkin even tighter, like he was holding on to it for dear life. Shaq's chest tightened. Something was wrong with this kid. The plane gave a slight lurch as the wheels left the runway, ascending into the night sky. The cabin hummed with the mechanical sounds of flight, seatbelts clicking, overhead compartments rattling slightly, the muffled chatter of passengers. But to Shaq, it all felt distant, like background noise to something far more pressing. He stole another glance at the kid. The boy's expression had gone eerily still, his breathing slow, controlled, like he was bracing himself for something. Shaq's gut twisted. Who was Dylan, and why did it feel like that name was reaching out from a past he had long tried to forget? The plane jolted suddenly, a sharp tremor rippling through the cabin as it ascended higher into the night sky. A few gasps echoed from nervous passengers, and overhead compartments rattled as if something unseen had knocked against them. The seatbelt sign flickered on, accompanied by the captain's steady voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Shaq barely registered the announcement. His focus remained fixed on the boy. The kid wasn't reacting like the others. He didn't flinch at the turbulence, didn't look around in alarm like the rest of the passengers. Instead, his fingers clenched tighter around his sketch, his breathing shallow, his body stiff. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. Shaq had seen nervous people before. He had sat in countless boardrooms where men twice his age had tried to mask their fear behind forced smiles and steady hands. But this wasn't the fear of flying. This was the fear of being seen. The turbulence passed as quickly as it had come, but the air inside the cabin had shifted. The whispers began. Quiet at first, hushed voices passing between rows like an invisible current. Who's that kid traveling with? Where's his family? Shaq wasn't the only one who had noticed. A few rows ahead, a middle-aged man in a suit, a nervous-looking businessman with thin glasses and jittery hands, kept glancing at the boy. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, then leaned toward a flight attendant who was making her way down the aisle. "Excuse me," the businessman said, his voice low but urgent. "That kid over there, he's alone, isn't he?" The flight attendant barely spared the boy a glance. "I'm sure his guardian is somewhere on board, sir." The businessman didn't look convinced. He turned back to Shaq, catching his eye as if seeking validation for his concern. Shaq said nothing. He wasn't about to get involved in something that wasn't his problem. And yet, when he looked at the boy again, he saw the slight tremble in his fingers, the way his small shoulders curled inward, as if trying to make himself smaller. Shaq had spent his entire life reading people, their confidence, their fears, their lies. Right now, this kid wasn't just nervous, he was hiding something. The businessman hesitated for a moment longer, then turned back toward the boy. He leaned forward in his seat, voice cautious but firm. "Hey kid, where are your parents?" The boy's head snapped up. His eyes, dark and guarded, locked onto the businessman like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I don't know." A lie. Shaq knew it instantly. The businessman frowned. "You don't know? You're traveling alone?" The boy didn't answer. He clutched his napkin tighter, his knuckles white. The whispers grew louder now. A woman across the aisle turned to look. A man a few rows back nudged his wife. Shaq could feel the shift in the air, curiosity turning into suspicion. The boy's breathing grew uneven, his fingers twitched against the sketch. His body remained perfectly still, but his eyes darted around the cabin, searching for exits, for escape. Shaq had seen that look before, the look of someone trapped. The businessman exhaled sharply and turned back to the flight attendant. "I really think you should check the manifest, if he's unaccompanied." The boy suddenly shook his head, fast, almost frantic. "Please don't." His voice was so soft, so desperate, that for a moment the entire row fell silent. And then, just as quickly as the moment had come, the boy lowered his head again, curling over his sketch as if willing himself to disappear. Shaq could feel it now, the weight of something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Concern. Shaq exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. The energy in the cabin had shifted. What had started as a quiet, uneventful flight was now filled with murmurs and curious glances aimed at the boy. The businessmen had stopped pressing, but Shaq could feel the weight of everyone's unanswered questions hanging in the air. The boy had barely moved since his whispered plea. His head was bowed, his arms locked around the napkin sketch as if it were the last piece of something he couldn't bear to lose. His breathing was controlled, almost too controlled, like he was forcing himself not to shake. Shaq had spent years mastering the art of reading people. He could smell a lie, sense a bluff, and pick apart a nervous breakdown before it even started. And this kid? He wasn't just nervous. He was carrying something heavy, something that didn't belong in the hands of a child. Shaq leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You want to tell me what's going on?" The boy's fingers twitched, but he didn't lift his head. Shaq's voice softened, though even he wasn't sure why he cared. "Kid, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to know, where's your family?" For a moment, the boy didn't answer. The hum of the engines filled the space between them, the steady vibration of the aircraft pressing against Shaq's ears. Then, barely above a whisper, the boy spoke. "I won't see them again." Shaq's chest tightened. The way he said it, so final, so absolute, sent an uneasy chill through him. He should have let it go, should have nodded and turned back to his own business like he always did. But something about this kid wasn't letting him. Shaq straightened in his seat. "What do you mean? They waiting for you somewhere? Did you run away?" The boy's jaw clenched, his grip on the napkin tightening. For a second, Shaq thought he might answer. But instead, the boy's shoulders tensed, and in one swift, jarring motion, he ripped the napkin in half. The sound was small but sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. Shaq's breath hitched. The boy's face didn't change, didn't even flicker, but his hands trembled as the two halves of the sketch fluttered onto the tray table. The action sent a ripple through the nearby passengers. A few heads turned. Someone whispered. A flight attendant, noticing the movement, started making her way down the aisle. Shaq's patience thinned. Something was very wrong, and no one else seemed to see it. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, keeping his voice low but firm. "That drawing meant something to you. Why'd you tear it up?" The boy didn't answer. He just sat there, fingers curled into fists, staring blankly ahead like he wasn't even in the cabin anymore. "Sir, is there a problem here?" Shaq turned to see the flight attendant standing beside him, her expression polite but edged with suspicion. Before he could respond, the businessman from earlier cut in. "That kid's traveling alone. He won't say where he's going. No parents, no guardian. You should check your records." The boy's head snapped up. His lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time since the flight began, his eyes showed panic. The flight attendant's brows furrowed, her gaze flickering between Shaq and the boy. "Sir, are you bothering this child?" she asked Shaq, arms crossing. Shaq blinked, caught off guard. "What?" The boy stayed silent. Didn't defend him. Didn't react. The attendant's frown deepened. "I need you to return to your seat and stop engaging with him. If he needs assistance, he can ask. Otherwise, I'll have to report this." Shaq wanted to argue, but the kid's blank, unreadable expression told him he wouldn't win. The boy had shut down completely, and Shaq hated it. Because now he knew. This wasn't just a scared kid on a plane. This was a kid hiding something. And nobody was listening. Shaq forced himself to lean back in his seat, jaw clenched as the flight attendant walked away. He could feel the weight of a few lingering stares, but eventually, the murmurs died down, and the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The boy hadn't moved. He still sat there rigid, hands resting on the torn napkin sketch like it was something sacred. Something he had destroyed on purpose but couldn't quite let go of. His face remained unreadable, but Shaq could sense something brewing beneath the surface. Regret, fear, resignation. Shaq exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He didn't know why he cared. He wasn't a man who got involved, not in personal matters, not in things that didn't affect his carefully structured life. Yet here he was, watching over a kid he didn't even know, drawn to something he couldn't explain. Then, it happened. A small folded piece of paper slipped from the boy's coat pocket, tumbling silently onto the floor between their seats. Shaq's eyes flickered to it immediately. The boy didn't seem to notice. For a second, Shaq hesitated. He had no business picking up something that wasn't his. But something. Instinct, curiosity, or maybe that deep-rooted feeling in his gut that had been nagging at him since the flight began, urged him forward. Casually, careful not to draw attention, Shaq leaned down and picked up the paper. It was old, slightly crumpled, edges worn from being handled too many times. His fingers hovered over it, debating whether to unfold it. Then his eyes landed on the faint, handwritten words peeking through the crease. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone." Shaq's chest tightened. Gone. The word hit him like a gut punch, a cold weight settling in his stomach. His pulse quickened. He knew what notes like this meant. He had seen them before. Letters that people left behind when they had made up their minds about something irreversible. Letters filled with final words, confessions, regrets. His throat felt dry as he carefully unfolded the letter, just enough to glimpse a few more words. "I tried to fix it. I really did. But I can't anymore. I just wanted them to know I—" A shadow fell over him. Shaq looked up. The boy was staring right at him, his dark eyes locked onto the letter in Shaq's hands, expression unreadable, yet completely knowing. He knew Shaq had seen it. He wasn't surprised, and he didn't try to take it back. He just watched. And that, more than anything else, sent a chill through Shaq's entire body. Shaq's fingers curled slightly around the letter, heart pounding in a way that felt foreign to him. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the boy didn't react. No panic, no sudden attempt to snatch it back, just a quiet acceptance, like he had already made peace with whatever the letter contained. Shaq cleared his throat, keeping his voice low. "Where'd you get this?" The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flickered to the letter, then back up to Shaq. Something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Finally, in a near whisper, he said, "It's mine." Shaq hesitated, watching him carefully. "You wrote this?" The boy barely nodded. Shaq's stomach twisted. A kid wrote this. He glanced down at the paper again, fingers itching to unfold it fully, but something inside him resisted. It felt too personal, too final. He had spent his life making ruthless decisions, taking what he wanted without hesitation. But this wasn't a business deal. This was a kid's last message to the world. He shouldn't have seen it, yet he couldn't let it go. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, jolting the cabin slightly. The letter nearly slipped from Shaq's grasp, but he caught it quickly, his pulse hammering in his ears. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to push back the tightness forming in his chest. His voice came quieter this time. "Who were you writing this for?" The boy blinked slowly, his fingers curling into his sleeves. He swallowed, then murmured, "My family. But they won't read it." Shaq frowned. "Why not?" A pause. Then, barely audible, "Because I won't be there to give it to them." A lump formed in Shaq's throat. The weight of those words settled over him like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. He had walked into countless high-stakes negotiations, faced down men who had everything to lose, but nothing had ever rattled him like this moment. "That's not true, kid. You can—" The boy shook his head, his expression remaining eerily calm. "I already decided. It's better this way." Shaq felt something inside him snap, frustration bubbling to the surface. This was wrong. Whatever this kid was carrying, it was too much. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to something firm, something grounded. "Listen to me. No matter what's going on, it's not too late to... Please." The single word cut through the air like a blade, soft yet sharp enough to silence Shaq instantly. The boy's face remained still, but for the first time, Shaq saw it. The flicker of something behind his dark eyes. Exhaustion. Sorrow. The kind of weight no child should have to bear. He wasn't just sad, he was giving up. And that realization made Shaq's stomach twist painfully. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, the plane cutting through the night sky, oblivious to the storm brewing inside one of its passengers. Shaq clenched his jaw, staring at the boy, staring at the letter. He was out of his depth, completely unprepared for this kind of situation. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this kid disappear, not without a fight. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and constant. But inside Shaq's head, there was nothing but noise. A whirlwind of fragmented memories, half-formed thoughts, and a gut-wrenching feeling that something wasn't right. The letter's words echoed in his mind, tangled with the boy's unsettling stillness. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone." Shaq clenched his jaw. He had no reason to care, no reason to get involved. And yet, as he stared at the boy, small, fragile, burdened with something far too heavy for his age, he felt something he hadn't in years. The turbulence struck again, jolting the plane sharply to the side. Passengers gasped, some gripping their armrests, while the flight attendants steadied themselves along the aisles. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring everyone that it was just a rough patch, but Shaq barely heard him. Because when the boy's napkin sketch fluttered to the floor, half torn but still visible, Shaq felt his entire world tilt in a way that had nothing to do with the plane. It was a house. Not just any house. His house. Shaq's breath hitched. He hadn't seen that place in years, not since he had walked away from it, from everything, from Dylan. The realization struck like a hammer to the chest. Dylan. A name he had buried under years of success, power, and distance. A name that now clawed its way back into his consciousness with an urgency that left him breathless. Shaq swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. His younger brother had always been the sentimental one, the dreamer. Dylan had sketched just like this, napkins, notebooks, the backs of old receipts. He had drawn that house 100 times over, each version more detailed than the last, as if he were afraid of forgetting what home was supposed to look like. And now, sitting just a few feet away from him, a different boy was drawing the same house. The air in Shaq's lungs turned to stone. He leaned forward, gripping the armrest. "Kid, where did you learn to draw like that?" The boy hesitated. The turbulence rattled the overhead compartments again, and for a split second, Shaq thought he saw something flash across his face. Fear, recognition, maybe both. Then, in the quietest, most fragile voice, the boy whispered, "Tell them I tried." Shaq froze. The words cut through him like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Because they weren't just words. They were Dylan's words. The last thing Dylan had said to him before Shaq had left all those years ago. The cabin felt too small, the air too thin. The turbulence had nothing on the storm raging inside Shaq now. He turned to the boy, his voice hoarse, unsteady. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer. He just looked at him, his dark eyes filled with something that made Shaq's stomach twist into knots. Loss, regret, and something far worse, recognition. Shaq's past had finally caught up to him, and it was sitting right in front of him. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a shallow breath. It was so quiet, so soft, that Shaq almost missed it under the hum of the aircraft. But when he turned his head, he saw it. The boy's fingers twitching, his face losing what little color it had left. Then, all at once, the boy went completely still. Shaq's gut twisted. He had spent his life ignoring warning signs, burying them under logic and control. But this was different. something was wrong. The napkin sketch, the letter, the eerie familiarity. None of it mattered now. The kid was clutching his chest. His small fingers curled over the fabric of his oversized coat, gripping it weakly, as if trying to hold himself together. His breathing turned ragged, uneven, each inhale shallower than the last. Shaq's pulse kicked into overdrive. Hey kid. Shaq leaned closer, his voice sharper than he intended. The boy's head swayed slightly, but he didn't respond. Panic crept into Shaq's veins. Look at me. Talk to me. Nothing. The boy's lips parted, but no words came out. His chest rose and fell in erratic, uneven movements, his body swaying forward as if he were about to collapse. Shaq lunged. He didn't think, he just moved. His hands reached out, gripping the boy's shoulders, giving him a slight shake. Hey, stay with me. The boy's eyes fluttered open, barely. He stared at Shaq like he was looking through him. His pupils were unfocused, his body weak, and in that moment, Shaq knew. This wasn't just nerves. This wasn't fear. Something was killing him. A sharp gasp escaped the boy's lips, his fingers trembling against his chest. Help! Shaq's voice boomed through the cabin. Passengers turned, startled, some already murmuring in confusion. A few rows ahead, the nervous businessman looked over, alarm flashing across his face. The nearest flight attendant rushed over, concern flickering into something more serious when she took one look at the boy. What happened? She asked, kneeling beside them. I don't know, Shaq snapped. He can't breathe. Do something. The flight attendant immediately reached for her intercom. We need medical assistance in row 14. Her voice was calm, but Shaq could see the tension in her fingers. The boy was slipping away. Shaq's hands tightened on the kid's arms. He had no idea what he was doing, had no control over the situation, and he hated it. Stay with me, kid. Keep your eyes open. The boy let out a weak breath, his lips trembling. Then, barely above a whisper, he finally spoke. I'm not supposed to be here. Shaq's blood ran cold. What? His voice was barely a whisper. The boy blinked, his gaze hazy, unfocused. His breathing hitched, his body shuddering slightly. And then, with a soft, almost sorrowful exhale, he whispered, But I had to say goodbye. The words struck hard, a punch to the chest, a sinking weight in Shaq's stomach. Goodbye. Shaq's breath caught. His hands tightened instinctively around the boy, as if holding him in place could stop whatever was happening. No! Shaq shook his head. You're not going anywhere. We're gonna fix this. You hear me? You're not... The flight attendant placed a firm hand on Shaq's arm, her tone urgent. Sir, we need space. Shaq hesitated, his body tense. He didn't want to let go. He couldn't. But then the boy let out a soft, tired sigh, and Shaq had no choice. He let go. The flight attendant and a passenger, a doctor who had rushed forward, took over, checking the boy's pulse, asking him questions he was too weak to answer. The hum of the plane, the murmurs of the passengers, the steady instructions from the doctor. It all blurred into white noise. Shaq just watched. His fists clenched at his sides. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this kid? Why did he know that house? Why did he say goodbye like it was final? And most importantly, why did it feel like Shaq was losing something he couldn't afford to lose? The hum of the aircraft was deafening in its normalcy, a cruel contrast to the chaos unraveling inside Shaq's mind. The boy lay still, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The medics weren't here yet. They wouldn't be until the plane landed. And Shaq couldn't do anything. His fingers clenched around the torn napkin sketch, the last thing the boy had created before his body started failing him. The image of the house stared back at him, haunting in its familiarity. It was more than just a drawing. It was a message, a connection to a past Shaq had buried long ago. The boy's eyes fluttered, his lashes trembling against his pale skin. Then, just as the plane started its final descent, his body went completely still. Shaq felt it happen before his brain fully processed it. No, stay awake. His voice was rough, edged with panic. He grabbed the boy's shoulder, shaking him slightly. Kid, open your eyes. No response. The flight attendants rushed over, their once calm expressions replaced with urgency and fear. A woman pressed 2 fingers to the boy's throat, searching for a pulse. The plane was still minutes away from landing, but time had taken on a strange, suffocating quality. Like everything was moving too fast and too slow at once. Shaq's breath was unsteady. He'd been in countless high-pressure situations before. Boardroom deals worth millions, stock crashes, betrayals, losses. But nothing had ever made him feel as helpless as this moment. The torn napkin crumpled under the weight of his grip. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. He had already lost Dylan. He couldn't lose this boy, too. The wheels touched the ground with a jolt. The flight attendants wasted no time in preparing for an emergency medical team to board. Shaq barely heard the announcements, barely saw the concerned faces around him. All he could focus on was the boy, so small and fragile, and the unbearable tightness in his chest. Then, finally, the paramedics arrived. They worked fast, voices sharp with precision, checking vitals, asking questions Shaq didn't have answers to. "What happened?" one of them asked, glancing at Shaq as they lifted the boy onto a stretcher. Shaq swallowed, his throat dry. He couldn't breathe. He said he wasn't supposed to be here, that he had to say goodbye. His own words felt like a weight pressing against his ribs. The paramedic frowned but didn't ask more. "We need to get him to a hospital now." Shaq's legs moved on their own. Before he even realized it, he was following them, his steps unsteady but determined. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know why he was doing it. But something in his gut told him that he had to see this through. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Shaq sat in the waiting area, the napkin still in his hands, its edges torn and frayed. It was absurd, the way he couldn't let go of something so small. The doctors had rushed the boy into an examination room. They wouldn't let Shaq in, wouldn't tell him anything until they had answers. So he waited. And for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. His eyes drifted to the napkin again. He traced the lines of the drawing, the porch, the windows, the trees that had stood tall in his childhood. Dylan's trees. His chest tightened painfully. He had left Dylan behind, left everything behind. And now, somehow, some way, this boy had brought it all back to him. Why? What was the connection? "Mr. Shaq." He snapped his head up. A nurse stood before him, her expression careful, measured. "Are you family?" she asked. The question hit like a punch to the gut. Shaq opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't family. He wasn't anything to this boy. He didn't even know his name. And yet, the words that came out of his mouth were, "Yes." The nurse nodded, accepting the lie, or maybe recognizing the truth hidden within it. He's stable for now, but he was in critical condition when he arrived. His body is severely weakened. Do you know if he has any existing medical conditions? Shaq shook his head. "I don't know. I just met him on the plane." Her brows furrowed. "Then why?" "Because he knew my brother." The words came out before Shaq could stop them. His own voice startled him. The nurse hesitated, then sighed. "Maybe you should see this." She handed him a plastic bag. Inside was the letter. The same letter Shaq had only half read before. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled it out and unfolded it completely. And then, he saw it. The final words. The ones he hadn't read before. "I wanted to tell you sooner. I wanted to find you before it was too late. My name is Elijah. I'm Dylan's son." Shaq's vision blurred. His grip on the paper tightened. And for the first time in years, Shaq felt something break inside him. The boy, Elijah, had been trying to find him, trying to tell him the truth, and Shaq had almost been too late to hear it. He exhaled shakily, running a hand down his face. He had spent so long running from the past, from Dylan, from the weight of the choices he had made. But now, the past had found him, and this time, he couldn't walk away. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine what's coming next. What would you do if a forgotten past came knocking at 30,000 feet? Stay connected for more gripping tales of mystery, redemption, and the unexpected turns life throws our way. Follow us for more suspenseful, emotional, and thought-provoking stories, because sometimes the truth finds you when you least expect it. Don't miss what's next.